I'm glad you came. Welcome to the Gonzaga Socratic Club. The Gonzaga Socratic Club, if you don't know, takes its name from the Oxford Socratic Club of the mid-1900s, which was presided over by famous Christian author and apologist C.S. Lewis. The motto of the Oxford Socratic Club, which we have borrowed for the Gonzaga Socratic Club, is to follow the argument wherever it leads, especially concerning understanding truths about Christian worldview and Christian practice. So we meet about once a month during the academic year, and we've been going for about 15 years. So I'm hoping the video is working today. I had to set it up. Usually a grad student does it for me, and I don't know what I'm doing. So we've had multiple challenges on the technology front this afternoon. But we're glad you're here. We have a very special Socratic Club today. Dr. Ed Schaefer, who is a former professor here at Gonzaga, has returned to bring the truth of Gregorian Chant to the people. So he's going to be talking about the history and development and just trying to help us understand what Gregorian Chant is all about. So if you would, please welcome Dr. Ed.
I was here last year for a couple of days in Idaho, but this is the first time I've actually been back on the Gonzaga campus since I left in 2007. It's really good to be back. It's very different from when I left, I can tell you that. So the original title of my presentation is here. It was the Origin, Development, and Future of Gregorian Chant. As I worked on this, the development piece is it's fascinating, but it's technical and it's long, and I was afraid it would be a little too long tonight, so I've swapped that out to give you a short expose on the impact of Gregorian Chant in Western civilization, and I think I can do that in a more entertaining kind of way. And then, well, I've decided I really can't predict the future, but I can with certainty tell you why chant is important to the Mass, and therefore why it should be an intrinsic part of the future of the Mass. So with that, I've changed the title to how, why, and how, where, and why. So let's begin with how Gregorian chant developed. After the persecution of the church ended in the 4th century, the rites of the church, now with the full support of the Roman Empire, developed a richness very quickly. And music also developed this richness to enhance the ceremonies. And we know that there were several places in which chant developed in related but somewhat independent manners. And of these ancient chant schools, we know of at least 5. We know of one in Benevento, we know of one in Rome, Milan, Spain, and Gaul. Certainly there were others. All of this music was composed, improvised, performed as one contiguous process. And none of it was written. It was all transmitted by an oral tradition. In the middle of the 8th century, Pepin the Short entered into an agreement of rapprochement with Pope Stephen II. In exchange for the Pope giving Pepin's claim to the throne legitimacy, Pepin agreed to give Pope Stephen protection from the Lombards. And as a part of this process, Pope came to Gaul and stayed with Pepin for a lengthy period of time. During this stay, hello, oh, good to see you.
Good to see you.
During this time, I got distracted.
Yes, I'm sorry.
During this stay, Pope Stephen reconsecrated Pepin as king on January 6, 754, in a ceremony that was evoked in the coronation of every French king until the French Revolution in 1789, over 1,000 years later. Also during the Pope's stay, Pepin was exposed to the Roman liturgy. He saw in this liturgy a way to unify his kingdom religiously and also politically as a kind of byproduct of this religious unification. I don't mean religious in the sense of converting people. I mean, religious in the sense of practice. There was no separation of church and state at this time. He set into motion a process in which he imposed the Roman liturgy throughout all of Gaul. Pepin asked the Pope to send musicians and the books of the Roman Mass to Gaul to help him spread the Mass throughout this kingdom, and his son, Charlemagne, would continue this process vigorously. Now, Charlemagne's interest in church music and his solicitude for its propagation and adequate performance throughout the empire have never been equaled by any civil ruler before or since. Tradition tells us that he not only took members of his own chapel to Rome with him in order that they might learn the chant at its fountainhead, but he also begged Pope Adrian I in 774 to let him have 2 of his papal singers. One of these papal chanters, Theodore, was sent to Metz. Are we there? Oh, there he is. Was sent to Metz, and the other, Benedict, to the Schola Cantorum at Soissons. And according to Eckhart IV, the chronicler of the 10th century of the monastery of St. Gall, the same pope sent 2 more singers to the court of Charlemagne. Now, in 774, the court would have been an itinerant court. It wasn't until the 790s that Charlemagne decided that the court would be established at Aachen permanently. But one of these singers, Peter, reached Metz, which may have been where the court was at that time, because we know that Odo of Metz was the architect of the palace in Aachen. The other singer, Romanus, was first detained at St. Gall by sickness, and afterwards obtained permission from the emperor to remain there. And it's to this presence of monks from Rome in St. Gall, Metz, nearby Laon, where a Messine form of notation also developed, and elsewhere, that we owe the manuscripts with the earliest forms of music notation and the earliest preserved chants that we have. So they become a really important part of this transmission process. All right, so I'm going to go back now. So now we've got Pepin entertaining Pope Stephen in Gaul. We know that over the next several years, singers were sent up to Gaul. All right. What happened in this process was an extraordinary event that changed the course of Western music. When Pepin began this process of Romanizing the Gallic liturgy, there was no written music. The texts were written. Since the texts of the Mass had been relatively uniform since the late 5th century, there was no problem for the Franks, that is, the subjects of the Frankish kings, Pepin and Charlemagne, to absorb the texts. However, with regard to the music, it was a different matter. The Frankish musicians were not as comfortable with the Roman chants as they were with the Roman texts. What transpired was a kind of hybridization, music that was essentially Roman in its contour, but infused with a Frankish style of ornamentation. And this Romano-Frankish hybrid is what we have come to call Gregorian chant. And about this same time, perhaps influenced by Charlemagne's technical knowledge of music, or his vigorous efforts to have chant sicut sadit ecclesia romana, sung as in the Roman Church, and his imperial commands regarding the education of boys in music, especially the singing of psalms, that systems of notation began to be developed. We've already seen the earliest and most important manuscripts have come from these areas. When these systems of notation were developed, the music was slowly changed in a fundamental way from an improvised, orally transmitted repertoire to a fixed repertoire. And that repertoire has been fixed with extraordinary care. When you look at the manuscripts of all these different local communities throughout Gaul, and especially what we call Germany today, the agreement among the manuscripts is incredible. It's just incredible. It's really incredible in Germany, the place that gave us the Volkswagen and, right? I mean, they mechanized the system really carefully. The French, not so, it's a little bit okay here, and this was a little different, and that was a little different. But in the big picture, the correlation correlation is amazing. It was a very carefully preserved tradition. Now, we could go through what happened to Gregorian chant, its decline, and probably it hit the nadir in the 15th, 16th century, its restoration in the 19th century. It is a fascinating story. We'd be here 2 weeks. So I'm going to do something a little different. Oh, yes, okay. I'm sorry. As this repertoire, the Holy Roman Empire moved southward, remember Charlemagne was crowned as Holy Roman Emperor in 800. As the Holy Roman Empire moved southward, this hybridized Romano-Frankish chant, which now was made, imposed as the music of the empire, suppressed all the other repertoires. And became uniform. There's some really fascinating stories. Like I mentioned Benevento. If you look at a Beneventan manuscript, everything seems fine. It's going down and going, and then all of a sudden you'll find something that just doesn't fit, it makes no sense at all. And then you go on, and then there's another one stuck in that makes no sense at all. And what we've come to understand is that when Charlemagne's people came down and plopped the manuscript down and said, this will now be your music, copy it and teach it to your people, the scribes did what they were told, but they snuck in their old Beneventan chants to preserve them, right? And so that there's different stories like that. It's how we know about the earlier repertoire. Anyhow, so where is its place in Western civilization? This music not only became the music of the empire, but it also became the foundation for virtually all the polyphonic music of the Western civilization until the Protestant revolt in the 16th century. Now I might note that what we call polyphony, harmonized music, is unique to Western civilization as an indigenous music. We are the only society whose indigenous music is polyphonic. Yes, you could say, well, what about when I hear Indian music and there's the sitar playing and so on, well, there are drones and things like that, but the music is not intrinsically polyphonic in the same way that Western music is. Other civilizations that have polyphonic music, it's been adapted from Western music. Japan might be a great example of that. Japan was all monophonic music until the Western missionaries came. And the first Western music they had was chant, and then as they developed their polyphonic style, it was included in the West. And today, Japanese composers are trying to infuse idiomatically Japanese things into Japanese music, but it is a unique gift to the world, Western polyphony. So, I thought I might give you a few examples, do like a little musical tour here, of how this music served as the foundation for Western music. So we'll start here. This is in the middle of the 9th century, end of the 9th century. The book is called the Musica Incuriatis, which translates roughly to a musical handbook. It was instructions for how to sing harmonized music, harmonized chant, or what we would call today as organ. It's the earliest preserved instructions we have for singing chant this way. So obviously they were doing it before. Nobody just wrote it down to preserve it. So, okay, now let's hope we get it to work. Oh, God bless. So here is the manuscript. This is what they're singing, and this is a modern transcription. Sounds very medieval, doesn't it? That's because it's medieval. All right. So we're going to jump 200 years. The cornerstone of Notre Dame Cathedral was laid in 1163. And about that time, beginning in 1160 until 90 years later, there was what we call the Notre Dame School of Composition. They established a school of music at the cathedral. And the purpose of this was to bring the greatest composers together to produce music for what was now one of the major centers of culture and the liturgy one of the great composers of this school was Leonin. He composed a book called Magnum Liber, what was it called? Magnus Liber Organi, right? This is why things should be in Latin, because that's much prettier than the big book of organ, right? So he took chants and he created organal sections and interpolated them into parts of the chant. So I'm going to give you a little example of just one of them. So this is the Alleluia for Easter Sunday morning. It's an extraordinary chant in and of itself, and it's extraordinarily unique. There's no other composition quite like it in the whole repertoire. I'm going to need to do this. So here's the chant if you're not used to it. Back and starts the beginning. There's a very fixed formula for the way this is sung. I'm just going to start it. Okay, so what happens is the cantor then sings the verse, the choir comes back in at the end here, and then they go back and sing the Alleluia. And Leonin began to create harmonic sections to substitute for part of that chant. Now watch how this goes. It's amazing. Just so you know what's happening, okay? The very first intonation, Alleluia, is harmonized. And the notes of the chant are in very long notes at the bottom. I'll try to point them out as we go. Solo part, and here's where he's going to stick some more I just can imagine, you know, I direct a school and we sing these chants every Sunday, and our high masses last about, I don't know, an hour and 40 minutes or something like that. These must have been, I don't know, 3.5 hours. You know, then they do these long, ordinary settings. It's pretty amazing. But it's extraordinary music. Right? All right, so now let's jump again. Now we're going to go another 200 years, excuse me. Machaut was one of the first composers, well, let me back up. Until this time, composers normally did what Leonin did. They would harmonize settings of the proper. Now, I'm not sure why. Perhaps because the congregation was still singing the ordinary at that time. I don't know. I'm not quite sure when that declined, okay? But that was the common practice, to harmonize. It wasn't until about the end of the 12th century where we had where composers started to compose settings of various parts of the ordinary, okay? So, just to clarify terms, right? The proper of the Mass are those chants that change for every week, okay? So that Alleluia only is sung once a year. So you compose this really great piece of music, but you're only going to sing it once a year, okay? The ordinary are the parts of the Mass that the texts don't change every week. The Kyrie, the Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, Benedictus, Agnus Dei, right? And so you can compose a setting of the ordinary, and your group can sing it often. So it's more efficient. But I don't know why they didn't think of that 200 years earlier. In any case, when they composed these movements, in the beginning, they were all sort of random. Somebody would compose a Gloria, or it's compose a Sanctus. They weren't really put together in cohesive units. Machaut was one of the first composers that looked at the complete ordinary of the Mass as a kind of musical cohesive unit, sort of like a multi-movement composition. So like when we go today to a concert and we hear a Mozart Mass or a Haydn Mass, and you hear all the movements that have some sort of compositional unity to them, whether it's thematic unity or something else, right? Machaut was one of the first people to do that. This is a Mass, the Messe de Notre Dame, the Mass of Our Lady. It's based on the movement you're going to hear is the Kyrie from Mass 4, which is traditionally sung for great feasts. So here's just the tune.
Kyrie
I'm going to stop there. And then, here's the Machaut. And you'll kind of hear it. So now they'll do the second Kyrie as a chant. And now they'll do a polyphonic one and so on. You can kind of hear in this music bits and pieces of the tune and the upper voices because it's a thematic unity, but the chant is really buried in the tenor voice. So if you recall the Leonin, where you had the two voices and the chant was on the bottom, well, they figured out that if they moved it up a voice and they put another voice below it, it gave them some more flexibility in the way the voices, in the way the intervals lined up. They weren't thinking harmonically in the way we do yet, but they were beginning. beginning to move in that direction. So it's buried in long notes. It's very, very difficult to hear. All right, so we're going to move now. This is now, we've gone to, this is post-Trent, just post-Trent. I thought I'd put something in that I was sure everybody would know. Victoria, one of the great composers of the Spanish High Renaissance School. This is his setting. Every parish choir sings this. This is the chant. Started to come apart, right? You had humanism coming in, so that it's kind of fascinating. The High Renaissance of Bruce is such that incredible music of Palestrina and Victorian, so it was also sort of the seeds of its demise in some way that the humanists thought that developed at that point. You also had the music that got developed from the various Protestant strains, Bach, for example, and so chant didn't have its universal influence, but it still remained at the heart and soul of the church's music. I didn't bring this example, but just think about like the Mozart Requiem, right? The introit quotes the chant from the introit from the Requiem Master. But I did want to share this with you. The music continued to be part of the central part of the church all the way up until the 1960s. After the Second Vatican Council, things changed radically. Okay, this composition was composed in 1966 or 7. I think 66. Maurice Duruflé was one of the great organists of the 20th century France. His organ compositions are still mainstay of virtuosic organ repertoire, and probably more than any other French composer at the time, he had an intimate feel for the nature and the way that chant moved and worked. He wrote a couple of masses based on Gregorian chant. This one he wrote right after the council. The musicians were, as you can understand, they were totally freaked out what was going to happen. And he wrote this mass as something of a protest, saying that you can write contemporary music, but you don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We can use the chant, and keep the musical patrimony of the church, and adapt it to contemporary music. And that's what this was an attempt to demonstrate. So if you don't know this chant, this is the chant for the great Feast of the Blessed Virgin. And here's the beginning of the chant. this mass is a mass for baritone choir. It was originally written for orchestra, and there's an organ arrangement of it. It's very fascinating what he does, because a lot of the time you'll hear the chant actually in the orchestra, and the men have a kind of descant or harmony to it, and then sometimes they trade off. But it's a magnificent piece of music. There's the tune for the chant. To stop that. That's sort of addicted to me. If I get distracted, I can't stop it, so I need to stop it when I can. So this is just a little taste of the enormous influence that chant had on the development of Western music. And certainly as the church is concerned, it was at the heart of her public prayer from the earliest days where the church came out of oppression after the Edict of Emancipation until the 1960s. All of which raises the question of its value today. Not just for the Mass, but I would also contend for the faith. So, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk generally, I'm going to walk you through one piece of music, and I'm going to try to do it in a way to help you understand this intimate relationship between theology, text, and music. I'm going to try not to get too technical about it, and use that simply as an example of this intimate relationship between chant and the Mass and why it's so important. That's my hope of what to do. So let me lay the introduction. So in today's culture, we often think of music as a pleasant add-on to Mass. A lovely add-on to be sure, but an add-on nonetheless. After all, we have a long tradition of low Masses. Masses with no music at all. We like to say that music is the handmaid of the liturgy. And typically, the way we conceive of that is kind of as a servant to the liturgy, right? And I would contend that the common conception of the word handmaid is somewhat impoverished. Mary said to the angel Gabriel, "I am the handmaid of the Lord." And indeed she was, she is. But she is so much more than a pleasant add-on to the history of salvation. She accepted Christ into the world at the Annunciation. She gave him to the world at his first public miracle at Cana, and she offered it to God on the cross. While she stood at the foot and shed the tears of a mother and bore the grief of a world. Chant and the Mass flowered together after the Edict of Emancipation. Chant has carried, preserved, and reinforced the beauty, truth, and goodness of the Mass throughout the centuries. And chant is the wings of the angel that carries the sacrifice of Calvary to the altar on high before the sight of the divine majesty, so that we might be filled with every grace and blessing. So I want to walk you through one piece of music, and hopefully I can demonstrate this. So here's the piece of music. This is the introit for Easter. I'm not going to play the recording yet. I want to talk about it a little bit, then I'll play the recording. The text, though, for you. I have risen, and still I am with thee. Alleluia. Thou hast placed thy hand upon me. Alleluia. Thy knowledge has become wondrous. Alleluia. Alleluia. So let's put this in context. As we move through Holy Week, many of the antiphons of the divine office take on an intensely personal nature. They often reflect the words of Christ himself, or they are scripture verses that can be seen as coming from the perspective of Christ himself. For example, Monday lauds of Holy Week. I turn not my face from those rebuking and spitting upon me. Same office, lauds of Monday. They paid They paid my price with 30 pieces of silver, for which I was appraised by them. Vespers, that same evening, you would have no power over me unless it had been given to you from above. So through this shift, this general, but not exclusive, but general shift in perspective, we're drawn intimately into the suffering of Christ. We experience in the Passion not just as bystanders, but through the eyes of Christ himself. We do not just watch him die, but we die with him. And therefore, on Easter morning, we also rise with him. Appropriately then, this introit for the Mass of Easter Day is also intensely personal. It draws from Psalm 138 to reflect an intimate conversation between Jesus and his Father, God the Father. It is it echoes Psalm 138's wonder of God's greatness and benevolence, but here it is not the psalmist singing, it is Christ himself, Jesus, who 3 days earlier cried out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Now marvels, I have risen, and yet still I am with thee. Thou hast placed thy hand upon me, thy knowledge has become wondrous. That is to say, thy knowledge, which is infinite, has become wondrous in me. Now there are alleluias in here as well. They punctuate this with that word that expresses a jubilation that is beyond words. So we have experienced the suffering and anguish of Christ's passion, now experience with him this wonder and jubilation. And again, we don't just watch him from afar as he rises from the dead and converses with his Father. We experience the resurrection in this intimate moment with his Father through his own eyes, and his alleluias become ours. Now, I've reflected a lot on this, and I think I want to try to express some way to say it's even deeper. Here's some verses from Psalm 138. Thou knowest my rising and my sitting. Another. If I ascend to heaven, thou art there. Another. If I descend into hell, thou art there. If I take wing early in the morning and dwell in the farthest parts of the sea, even there thou shalt lead me. Thy right hand shall hold me. I used to think about this as kind of an expression of the omnipotence, the omniscience, the omnipresence of God, but in a kind of purely intellectual way. But that's not what it is. This is a reminder that God is intensely involved in a very personal way in my life, in your life. Right? And Christ did not just die for me abstractly, as he died for, we say he died for the sins of all humanity, right? He died personally for my sins. And he rose personally so that I might attain eternal happiness with him. And this is the meditation with which we begin the Mass on Easter Sunday morning. Now, that's the text. So let's look at the music. Now, common wisdom would dictate that Easter deserves a triumphant, even bombastic introit for the state, right? We want timpani and like trumpets and all that sort of thing, right? This is the day the Lord hath made. However, the wisdom of the chant is not common. It is profound. And so thus, in the same way that the moment a mother holds a newborn child is a moment of quiet joy and wonder at the gift of life, so too, this intimate conversation between a father and his son, I can hardly even say it, a father and his son, now risen from the dead, is a moment expressed in music that is more introspective than bombastic, more profound than superficial. So let me play this for you, so you get a sense of it. I think that. Oh wait, you know what? Wait, I'm gonna change one thing. No, sorry. I want you to see that. I want you to see the earliest manuscript we have of this as you play it. This is this dates from the middle of the 10th century. This is the first word of the chant. It's a magnificent illumination. You can see the big R here, or you can see an E, you can see the X there. It's incredible, right? This is the notation right here for this word. And this is the next page. There's the notation, all right? And so now I'm going to put them together. And you can follow the ancient manuscript while you watch the ancient notation. And think about this, the nature of the music. Verses and so on and so forth. Okay. All right. Oops. All right. Now, let me talk about this general. Then I'm going to try to talk a little bit about the music as I wrap up, without getting too technical. Help me if I need help on that. Okay. So Don Johnner writes of this introit. It's all inner fervor, melody, breathing intense love, like a song coming from the quiet, unalterable depths of eternity itself. Exclusively personal. It has no thought of its listeners, no impetuous cries of triumph disturb it. It is not gloomy or dismal. It is a smile of purest joy. The melody itself is introspective, intensely personal, for which, right, with which it expresses an intensely personal truth. So let's look at this music. So there are three phrases on this piece. And even though it's an introspective, quiet piece, it's based on one of the ancient archaic modes. It's an extraordinarily ancient mode this piece is based on. Even in that context, there is this kind of intensity that builds. And let me try to help you see that. So first is a little musical play on this, right? It starts resurged, and it starts on the note re. Isn't that cute? And then immediately it jumps up, it rises, right? So there's this kind of little musical thing going on, all right? But as you can see, it starts and it kind of leaves you hanging at the end of this first phrase, right? I mean, there's a little bit of a tense, right? I have risen, and yet I am with thee. And there's this sort of moment of wonder, and the only thing that can bring that to a conclusion is what? Hallelujah. Then we see the second phrase. It expands it just a little bit. You see, here, the highest we got to was sol, and now we're going to rise to la, and it's a little bit longer, and you have this repeated F, fa, all the way through, which kind of gives it this sort of a energetic motion. Let's see. Oh, sweet, oh, sweet, so it's a little bit more intense, and now it ends with this hallelujah, and you expect it to go it doesn't. It flips the cadence on us and goes, ya, and it leaves you saying, we have more to go here. And now the final phrase is even expanded a little more. It goes a little lower, and it goes a little higher one more time. And watch this, it goes, ya, mis, fa, ta, es. So, thy knowledge has become wondrous. And we see this wondrousness of the knowledge having become wondrous what? In the God-made man. You see this descent of the melody. And then when we go back to it's the knowledge of God, and so the melody rises back up to its height that has become wondrous in this God-made man. And then we finish with now not a single, but a double alleluia, right? Alleluia. It has the same kind of hang that this cadence does. Alleluia. And it finally settles. It finally settles, all right? And now there's a couple of other little things. Look at this. Let's see, where are they? Yes. So, make sure I find the right spot. And so you see this little figure. We see the same music here. For me, it's a little reminder that, right, the one who has placed his hand upon me is the God of infinite knowledge. There's a little musical connection between posuisti and scientia. And I'm going to say one more final thing. I kind of referred to it in the second phrase, and that is this sort of subtle drive of fa, F, all the way through this piece. It takes on, in a certain sense, this importance of its own. It's kind of a vehicle that drives the intensity of the music in this introspective context. But ultimately, it's an ornament. And ultimately, we get this. And finally, it's going to go, Alleluia. One last time, one more time, and it settles, right? It's just an incredible piece of music, and so the theology, the beauty of the music, right, and the connection between the music and the text. This is how we begin Easter Sunday morning. And so the last thing I would simply say, I love it if we had time to show you what all the ancient signs mean and how they actually influence this music. That's a whole other year in itself. But let me say in summary, by the hand of God and a fortuitous confluence of events, a most unique and uniquely beautiful music developed, chant. And it served as the foundation for all Western music, even polyphony, which itself is a unique contribution of Western civilization to the world. And in the same way, the Blessed Virgin is the handmaid of the Lord. It continues to be the handmaid of the liturgy. Deo gratias. Way too much time, but I was having.
That's fine, that's fine. The practice of the Socratic Club is to often have a commentator-respondent, just to spur our conversation. Father David Gaines, who was a student here at Gonzaga and sang in choir, has agreed to make a few comments about Dr. Schaefer's presentation.
Thank you, Dr. No,
That's touch.
thank you. So, I am neither a great musician nor a great philosopher, but I'm really happy to be here amongst both great musicians and great philosophers. I did also just want to give you a quick life lessons with Dr. Ed Schaefer to give this wonderful man a bit of honor in 1 minute. As a freshman or sophomore in college, I was in the university choir here on campus, and he was giving us this very difficult piece, and he always made us memorize these big long pieces that it took a lot of work, and I wasn't used to that, and I wasn't used to really good music either. But anyways, he had us memorize this piece, and one time I messed up, and I train wrecked the entire piece. My entire section and the entire choir was stopped because of me. And Dr. Ed knew it, and everybody else knew it because I messed it up so loud and proud. But in that moment, he didn't shame me, and he didn't say, okay, now because David messed it up, we have to move on. Instead, he said, I want you all, I don't know if you remember this, but I do. I want you all singing a little bit more like David is. And the point that he was making, which has been very edifying to me throughout the rest of my college career, but then also at the seminary and now into priesthood, is that when we get up and do something, we need to do it with the best of intentions. And if we mess up loud and proud. He wasn't He was not encouraging me to make mistakes or go off doing whatever. But he was trying to bolster these performers. And in my own work with youth and even within Gregorian Chant, this is part of what is always in the back of my mind, helping to encourage people sing. And a lot of times when people have a hard time musically, it's because they're not willing to give it their all. So life lessons with Dr. Andrew Schaefer. I'm most grateful for that. So today I have 10 minutes was my goal to speak with you just briefly on my own experience as a college student, seminarian, and priest for four and a half years is what I've been a priest. Very limited experience of where I've seen beauty of Gregorian chant and also practically how I'm seeking to implement that in my life as a priest and the like. But first we must begin with Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, who said in a wonderful apostolic exhortation, Sacramentum Caritatis, beauty is not mere decoration, but rather an essential element of the liturgical action, since it is an attribute of God himself and his revelation. So beauty in the sacred liturgy. Sorry, ignore my email, my unorganized email things up there, but for a moment. Beauty is not a mere decoration. So in the sacred liturgy, whenever we're applying beauty, whether musically or liturgically, in the liturgical actions, it's not mere decoration, but rather it's essential to our liturgical action because the liturgy is the work of God. I would like to propose that much of contemporary church music, and this is just going to be off the cuff because I said I'm not off the cuff off of my papers, but I'm not a master of philosophy or music, but here we are. Much of our contemporary church music, I believe, is filled with sentimentality. And this is why bringing Gregorian chant back to the fore of our liturgical lives is so essential, because there's a wonderful article in First Things by Benjamin Myers. He's a writer of First Things, and he wrote this very thought-provoking article that I highly recommend, called The Sentimentality Trap. His running definition of sentimentality is emotion in excess of its object. And he further says, sentimentality is not simply too much emotion, but an imbalance of emotion, an over-investment of emotion relative to that which is being invested. Sentimentality offers us, he then describes, the dubious chance to feel while bypassing the messiness of any real human engagement. So not too much feeling, but too thin of experience. I think my proposal is here today that a lot of our church music today is too thin of an experience of sacred music. And indeed, we would say it's more religious music than it is sacred because it's not designed for the sacred liturgy. Whereas Gregorian chant, it has tons of feeling, but you have to go through the experience. As Dr. Ed just walked us through resurged, you have to you can appreciate it just on its first time hearing, but then when you get down deep, it's wonderful. Benjamin Myers in this article then, I'm sorry to any of you great lovers of Thomas Kinkade, but Benjamin Myers compares Thomas Kinkade to bad art because you look at a Thomas Kinkade and you're instantly moved affectively. You're forced into a feeling without having to do the work. So you're forced into this quaint paradise of a garden home without having to do the work of sitting and the work of cultivating said home. And so he forces he says that Kincaid forces an affect by the viewer to feel at home in the quaint garden paradise of Kincaid's paintings while bypassing all of the messiness of life that is required to have such a beautiful home. So like I said earlier, much of our contemporary church music world is filled with a bunch of sentimentality. From Marty Haugen to St. Louis Jesuits, even to praise and worship music, there's lots to go around. And I would say, honestly, just practically as a priest, if I had to choose between Marty Haugen and St. Louis Jesuits music or praise and worship, I would choose praise and worship music, even though sometimes it's much more bombastic musically. At least it has the texts of Scripture most of the time, and at least it's contemporary, whereas a lot of this other stuff is, stuck in the 80s or 90s or 60s or 70s. So I just wanted to give you a short example then of an example of sentimentality, if you will. Bear with me for a moment, because I thought this just very apropos to my argument here. So on the fourth Sunday of Advent, I'll show you the prime example of what is good liturgically, but first I'm going to show you what is the worst example of that same text. But the introit for the fourth Sunday of Advent, as we're just on the cusp of welcoming the Christ child, we're pleading with God to allow the just one to come forth. And the text is, Rorate celi de super et nubes fluant. Skies, let the just one come forth like the dew. Let him descend from the clouds like the rain. Okay, so here's the poorest example of said text. Rain down, rain down your love on your people. So we can leave that behind. I won't sing anymore. Okay. Now, there's also some wonderful musicians today doing some work with the Gregorian Chant, which again I'll get to. But I wanted to share with you now something much more beautiful based on the Gregorian Chant that I'll get to. And I've done this actually practically on Rorate Celi Masses, which is Saturday morning Masses for Our Lady. I had 15 girls down in Walla Walla singing on Saturday mornings in candlelight only, singing this. Skies, let the just one come forth like the dew. Let him descend from the clouds like the rain. And then it goes on, pleading with God to let the just one come forth like the dew. All of this to the prime example of our liturgy and what has been with us and Dr. Ed would be able to tell us exactly when this chant came about. Fourth Sunday of the introit. Here it is. Rorate celi de super. This beautiful pleading to send forth the just one. So we ought not be trapped in sentimentality. That's my first point here. So we can leave behind rain down, rain down. I want to just give quickly then, in my last few minutes, 3 reasons people give as to why Gregorian chant is useless in our church today. And these are things that I hear very often from people in my work as a priest. Father Cashin Folsom, the first point is, Gregorian chant is irrelevant to contemporary people. Father Cashin Folsom, who's the new founder of the Benedictine monastery in Norcia, Italy, he said, chant is the church's love song to her Lord. She is the bride, her love song to the Lord. He and his monks recorded in 2015 a CD of Gregorian chant, and it debuted as #1 top seller on the charts for Barnes & Noble and Amazon. So many people are flocking to purchase these CDs. That's just a little point to show that many people are using it. Also, though, I wanted to, we all know the Dies Irae chant. I'm going to just very briefly have you listen to that. Beginning, hopefully. Everybody knows this beautiful melody. Day of Wrath, Day of Doom. It's the song that's sung to be normally in the old church to be sung at every funeral. and at a burial. And this same melody is being used in contemporary movies. Watch this. Okay, and then it goes on and on, but I just want to give you a couple more real fast. So this whole YouTube video, I did not create these, but direct quotes, and then I'll just quotes from the themes of it. Interestingly, all these points in the movie have something to do with death. Dum, bum, bum, bum. Just one more, couple more examples.
So you haven't told them your little secret.
Yeah, this one, It's a Wonderful Life. We all know that. Dum, bum, 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 bum. Okay, so I'm just trying to draw your attention to how this ancient chant of the Dies Irae is used by contemporary composers in movies. Huh? Not to mention all the New Agey and yoga enthusiasts who are finding chant to be a wonderful part of their mindfulness meditation retreats. Huh? So there's all sorts of reasons as to actually that Gregorian chant is very relevant. 2 more points. Gregorian chant is, often people say Gregorian chant is useless in our world in our church today because it's too hard and it's too mysterious for the average person. First, I just know from my own experience in working with children, they're very capable at learning Gregorian chant. They're very capable. Of course, some of the more melismatic chants, they're more difficult, and the Latin is difficult. But in comparison to a lot of things that we use in our contemporary church, I would say the chant is much easier. You know, so singing Mass 4 or Mass 3, any of these other ordinary parts of the Mass, much more accessible actually for children. I've experienced that in my own work with kids. But of course, at the same time, like that wonderful Pascam Nostrum, kids can't do all of that. But that's okay, because that's why we have Schola Cantorums, right? That's why we have trained musicians to do such a thing. Also, to the point of chant is too mysterious, I've often likened, to help people understand chant in Latin better, I've compared Latin and Gregorian chant to being a type of veil over the sacred texts of our liturgy. Though, of course, for hundreds of years, people knew Latin, so they understood directly what was going on. But nevertheless, those are sacred texts, and they're there to help us understand the deeper mysteries. The texts in themselves are not the end, right? They bring us to the deeper mysteries. The music is not an end in itself, but it brings us to the deeper mysteries. Anything that is veiled in our liturgy, when nuns wear their veils, when a priest is veiled in a chasuble, when the altar, the tabernacle, or the chalice are veiled, the church is saying that what is veiled needs to be given extra importance. And so I would say that Gregorian chant and Latin are beautiful ways for us to have a sense of the sacred and continue to cultivate that sense of the sacred within us. Okay, so people often say it is irrelevant to contemporary people, it is too hard and too mysterious for the average person, and it doesn't fit with what Vatican II wanted, nor is it active participation. All that would be way too much to get into, but needless to say, the Second Vatican Council did say Gregorian chant is to have pride of place in the sacred liturgy, though obviously that hasn't been practiced, but it did say Gregorian chant, all things being equal, Gregorian chant should hold a privileged place as being more proper to the Roman liturgy. The Church acknowledges Gregorian chant as specially suited to the Roman liturgy. Religious singing by the people is to be intelligently fostered so that in devotions and sacred exercises as also during liturgical services, the voices of the faithful may ring out according to the norms and pronouns and rubrics. So anyways, the Vatican Council did say Gregorian chant was a good thing. And then with regards to active participation, when people tell me, oh, well, chant makes so that I can't actively participate, I simply give them the note that active participation, you can be actively participating, as you are hopefully in my bombastic words now, you are actively participating by listening to my words with your mouths shut. And so that in the sacred liturgy, it's possible, sorry, that was my ode to Father Vivek, but that we can be actively and actually participants in the sacred liturgy by engaging our hearts and our minds and our ears with what's going on. The Second Vatican Council didn't say that every person was supposed to be doing all the actions of the church, contrary to popular belief. That is not what the Second Vatican Council said. So, in summary, once again, Gregorian chant helps us to fight the sentimentality trap of our modern contemporary musical world that I think is way too abusive to the liturgy today. And also then, when people tell me that Gregorian chant is useless for our church because it's irrelevant to contemporary people, it's too hard for the average person, it's not what Vatican Council asked for, I say, au contraire. And there we go. Thank you.
Perhaps we can pull some chairs up here.
David, we gotta take off.
I don't know, what time is it?
It's,
6:45.
Oh, I can
Have a seat up here. Don't fall off. So, questions, comments, please. What a surprise.
David, a lot of adolescents are learning Romulan. Are there other goofball languages adolescents are learning?
Yes,
I don't know.
Well, hello,
Klingon.
Klingon.
That's a favorite.
I mean, so to say that, you know,
Goofball language, just wrong.
I'll pay for that later. But my point is not to be a question, but there's so much the adolescents that are into. It's just so strange. Every year we have the Steubenville conference, and at the same time at the convention center, we have all these teenagers doing what that sci-fi ROM or whatever it is, dressed up in every god-awful thing you can think of, because they want a different reality than the one they're living with, and they give themselves over to it so easily. So I mean, for us to abandon our ritual is just it goes against the culture, it goes against the experience of most people.
Yeah, make a comment. You know, I think one of the tragedies of the Second Vatican Council was that it happened in the 1960s. Right? It was just in the middle of this massive cultural revolution, sexual revolution, everything. And it just became something of a victim of that. And I know when I was a little kid, and we'd go to the grossmother's house, right? And we would sing at Christmas. We couldn't have Christmas, right? So we sang "O Tannenbaum." I had no idea what it meant. But I knew that we sang "O Tannenbaum" on Christmas at grossmother's house, right? It was a part of who we were. We just did it. Now, eventually, I can figure that out, and I can know it better, and so on. And I've always thought it's so strange that we have to sort of justify our music. I mean, the Greek church doesn't have to justify their music, and the Russian church doesn't have to justify its music to the business, right? I mean, I've always thought it's just right, and I think we got caught in a kind of cultural vortex of some kind. And you know, I just, when that conversation starts, I just always, you know, I start to sweat because I said, there's no good outcome in this conversation. And it's just, you know, this is just our music. I shouldn't have to justify it. Right? I shouldn't have to make reasons why I sing my music. So there.
Just back in January I had 17,000 people at a conference. I didn't have them, I was there. There were 17,000 people at a Focus conference. While they did a lot of some contemporary music, they also had Gregorian chant. And these are young adults up to 22 years old, and they are embracing ancient music wonderfully. At the same time, they're also embracing all the other stuff, but they love it. So, it's interesting, who do we have to have the argument with and justify to is a certain group of people.
Oh, so thank you both very much. I had a pair of questions for Dr. Schaefer. So obviously then, based on what you said about how polyphony is and harmony is indigenous to the West, what we call music theory grew out of that music. So my question is, when you began having harmony, what sort of theory were they using to decide which harmonies to use? Just did they say, oh, that sounds pretty, we'll use that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's not one I can fully answer, except that I can say theory always follows practice, right? So the octalecos, the 8 modes, were described by theorists trying to understand the modality that had developed in what we call now Gregorian chant. And in fact, they misunderstood it. They created a theoretical process because they were trying to relate it to Greek modes, and they looked at the scales backwards. It was, I don't remember the details now, but I think the scale was moving down, and they looked at it going up, so that the arrangement of half steps and whole steps was all backwards. So the nomenclature was funny and everything else. But the essential point was, it was an attempt to describe music that already existed. Now, once the theory was in place, then they started going back and changing the music that didn't fit the theory so that it would not fit the theory, right? So there are chants that got changed after and Western music theory is an attempt to describe the practice that had developed. So, all I can say is it's a practice that developed, and then the instructor said, oh, well, this is what people are doing, and that's what I would imagine. I don't think they started with rules. I think they started with the practice and developed an understanding of rules based on what the practice was.
I just wanted to ask if you could comment a little bit on just like the idea of music ministry, that singing this, is in effect in some way kind of like a ministry of the church, and how it brings you into the life of the church. Would it help if, like, our choir right now, since it's Lent, the sopranos have stopped doing their desk hands, which I miss a lot more than I thought they would, so it must be a good Lenten practice.
Okay. I thought you were going to say, we're singing Gregorian chant because it's Lent, because Gregorian chant is this morbid, horrible, right? I've heard that more than once. Well, I mean, I don't know how to answer it except yes. I mean, right, the music that the Schola sings it's an incredible, it's an intrinsic part of the Mass. You can't do it without it. Not a high Mass, you can't do it without it. And that's a gift that these people, it's a service these people give, but it's a gift to themselves. It's, in some ways, it's a gift to them because not everybody's able to do that, right? And so it's a return to God of the gifts that He's given to you. But I don't know. That's not a. It's. I don't know. I don't think of those terms anymore. It's not the word ministry. I think has been. Yeah, it's just been over. It's created a monster. Right. So I don't think of those terms so much. But yes, to answer your question, simply yes. Yeah.
Could you comment maybe on the architecture of the churches themselves and how it enhanced chant and the development of chant? And
Well, yeah, so I had the privilege of singing the Gregorian choir in Paris for a while, and we sang in a number of Romanesque churches. I've never been in Romanesque churches, and they're extraordinary. I mean, they're because they're really thick walls and not big windows. They're very intimate spaces. I didn't expect that, but they're a very intimate space. And then of course you had the development of the Gothic architecture as polyphony was developing, right? And so you had a whole other kind of architecture and the way that music developed in there. I mean, these big polyphonic masses that sort of fill up the space. And I think probably the best way to demonstrate this, I'm a little nervous, but kind of in a negative way, when you see what's happened to architecture in the last half of the 20th century and now, right, where it's completely flipped everything. I mean, the ancient architecture was about being in the presence of God and having a recreation of the sacrifice of Calvary and offering that to God, and everything was designed to that. So visually it was set that way to the east end. All of the accoutrements, the ceremony and the music all fed into that. It was all that way. And so now our churches have been flipped around. The services are more anthropocentric than they are Christocentric. The music is going theatrical, so the acoustics flip everything to make it more theatrical acoustics. The emphasis on people hearing words, and so you have PA systems and all those kinds of things. I mean, I think the most recent architecture is a perfect example of how we have dramatically shifted on how we think about the Mass. And it has reinforced that, right? My pastor, I'm mostly associated with the traditional Mass in Sunday, but I help my pastor in the mornings at Synodos over Masses. And for years, he only did the Mass ad orientem. He wouldn't do it any other way. And the bishop in the last 6 months has forbid him to do that. Now, that's a conversation in and of itself. It's not actually within the bishop's authority to do that, but he decided it wasn't a fight he wanted to, it wasn't a battle he wanted to engage. And I'm amazed at how it's changed things. I mean, it's just radically changed everything. Just flipping the altar around has just changed it all. And I feel really sorry for him because he knew this was going to happen, but it's what it does. So architecture has a huge impact on everything. Yeah, it does.
There's a philosopher, Roger Scruton, who has a documentary called Beauty Matters. He talks about architecture. Build something to be useful, it will become the most useless thing. Build something to apparently be useless, and it will become the most useful of all. And so he even talks about church architecture and how, why is Notre Dame still standing? Will the Crystal Cathedral in California be standing? We hope. Yeah.
It's nice to see you, by the way.
Yes, you too. Welcome back. With regard to just the question of just the average parish, what if you have a choir who hears about this kind of thing and they think, we really love this and we really want to incorporate that or start using that more, but we don't know where to start? What are some resources where they can just kind of begin to just say, okay, how do we kind of get this rolling? You know what I mean?
Yes, I'll say two things of that. The first is I would send them to Church Music Association of America. It's the only organization in the country to serve Catholic church musicians in both forms of the Mass, and is devoted to preserving polyphony and chant, and done it in sort of the spirit of the Sicilian movement, with very practical aids and stuff. There's tons of stuff on the website. The colloquium of the year is incredible. I mean, that's the first place I would send them, and just spend a week devouring the website, and there's all kinds of materials. And related to that, I would say that you bring up a really valuable point, and that is this. Particularly with regard to the proper of the Mass, introit, the gradual, the offertory, okay? Those chants were never sung by the people, ever. They were composed in an improvisatory way by the Roman Schola Cantorum. They are very sophisticated music, and average parish choirs cannot sing them. And we have struggled with this forever. We have never figured out the best way to do this because we have lots of churches and lots of parishes. It's not like we're the Unitarian Church of San Francisco and there's one. right? And so they hire the best musicians in the city, and that's all they have. Parishes have all over the place, okay? So we, back in prior to the council, back in the 50s, many of you, if any of you are familiar, Carlo Rossini decided, we'll have the choirs do this way. We're going to set all the proper text to 4 psalm tones, 4 modes, 4 psalm tones, and choirs could sing them, right? And so they could have high masses because they could do the music for the proper. It wasn't sophisticated, and some people sort of poo-poo it these days and say, well, they're just silly. They're not anything like. You're right in a certain sense, but it allowed parish choirs that couldn't do it otherwise to have beautiful ceremonies in their masses. We're trying other ways to do that. Some more successful than others. There's the chant abrégé, which I think has some value. It's abridged forms, or they're a little shorter. I don't criticize those because I want people to learn the idiom, and I want them to do what they can do to make this work. So it is a struggle. It's a genuine struggle. I know you'll have some good things to add to this, because we now have this mentality that everybody's got to sing everything and so on. And so how do you do this sort of thing and so on? But and maybe you have maybe you have a choir, and maybe you just have a small school, and maybe it's only got 2 or 3 people that do certain things that not everybody can do. But in any case, to answer your direct question about the resources, I'd go to CMA. I think it's musicasacra.com. Lucian,
and just segue what you're talking about is the Kyriale, or the common of the Mass, would be it's a little more repetitive. It's certain parts are repeating. Would be a little more accessible.
Yeah, the ordinary is easier because the ordinary was sung by congregations back in the day, right? I mean, those chants weren't written down until the 12th or 13th century because they didn't need to. They already knew them. So that's a place to start. But when you said choir, just proper clicked into my brain. But
We're in a very difficult place in the United States because so many of our churches have been built as Protestant places of worship. When anything that isn't a rectangle turns into be a congregational church, a Calvinist church, and anything that's in a half circle thing is Protestant. And then it invites all sorts of Protestant activity, which a lot of ignorant people encourage. So we have this tremendous Protestant thinking in the United States as far as the worship goes in the Catholic Church. And it's so sad. And so how can you do that? His father has a church up in Deer Park. He could hardly do the proper Roman liturgy because the church building militates against it day after day. Any church that has a floor that goes down to the altar below the people is wrong. The altar should be above the people because Calvary's on a hill.
I said when I talked that one of the challenges is the council was held in the 60s. And it just, like I said, we were a cultural vortex. As you know, the liturgy is kind of the tip of the iceberg of what we're facing today, right? I mean, we have corruption in the church, we have scandal in the church, we have all kinds of things in the church. And so, at the same time, I have never been more optimistic about the future of the church. And I say this as a person who generally has a healthy bit of skepticism about things. But I've never been more optimistic because much of the problems that we're having are finally coming out in the open. And we can't clean things up until that happens. And now we can. And now we will have to. We cannot just shove this aside anymore. And I think there will come a day. I'd like to think I'll live to see it, but I'm not sure. But I think much of what we're doing now will be gone. I think we won't be building churches like we're doing. I think we won't have mass like we're having mass. I think we won't. I think the truths of the church will be taught from the pulpit, and they will be embraced by the people. It may be a much smaller church rising from the ashes, but I've never been more optimistic than I am now because all of everything's coming out in the open, and now we have the opportunity to clean it up. So you're right about the architecture. It's just, in my opinion, it's the tip of the iceberg. But we will Christ promised that the gates of hell would not prevail against the church. And if you believe that Christ is God, then you have to believe what he says is true. And it will happen. I don't know how right now, but that's not my problem. God will figure that out. Sister.
This question is kind of two-part, and it's for either one of y'all. How would
I need you to speak just a little louder.
Sorry. How would you respond to the idea that the church is ever ancient? People always quote that to me. Well, the church is ever ancient, ever new. So we need to embrace the new stuff, and then it kind of comes on the heels of full participation. Well, I don't know, so I can't sing it, aka I can't fully participate in mass. So, and I see that particularly with working with kids. So 2 or 3 times a week, I find myself working with children, like with liturgy, and I work with 2 other people, and it's kind of this trying to balance things when choosing the music for mass, because there's a concern about the kids. Let's give them something that they know and that they're going to enjoy.
Yeah. And your concern isn't with the kids; it's with the parents of the kids.
and so it's well, how do you respond and say, you know what, I'm sorry I can't feed you junk food, but how do you do that? I mean, because to them, that's all they've known, especially the kids and their parents, it's all they've known. And now you're introducing this weird old stuff that nobody knows and can't participate with, quote unquote. But how would you?
Well, the way I have addressed it is I've bailed. See, but I'm going to respond to this with a question, because this is true in almost every conversation that we end up in, whatever kind of church practice, not just music. It's all right. It's ever about the church being new and what no one has answered me successfully is that, well, how is all the new stuff working out for you? I mean, we've now had a post-conciliar church for whatever it is, 60 years, 70, whatever, okay? And we have no vocations. Our churches are empty. We have no youth in the churches. In 20 years, 2/3 of the people that are attending Catholic Mass today will be dead. I mean, how's it working out? And so I want somebody to answer that to me before I get into a conversation with them about, well, we need pop music, or we need this music, or we need that. Tell me how everything is working out with this direction, and then let's figure out the best way to go. I don't know the answer to your question. I mean, I do help with the Novus Ordo parish in the mornings, and we have slowly, the congregation, they sing a Latin ordinary now, and when we got into the Gloria, there was a little bit of pushback, and we preached about it, and slowly, we just got a good pastor, and he's just, so they trust him, and so, but there was some blowback from it, and it's rough. It's rough. There's no good way. If you have a really supportive pastor and the people trust the pastor, it helps lots, really lots.
Just a quick thought on it, though, is that we do live in a multicultural environment, and there are people from all over. And we can actually go to this because the church is supernatural, super national, if you will, can take up all this, and the chants do supersede. They were everywhere. It was Catholic. It was everywhere.
It is funny how you have you can have. It's okay to have a Hispanic mass. It's okay to have a Vietnamese mass. It's okay to have a whatever name your. But if it's Latin, oh my gosh, we can't do that. Right? And I don't. You're right. In a multicultural society, but I'm not so sure I would. I like the idea of it being super cultural. Right? We are our own culture. I'm a little hesitant answering it with the notion about being multicultural, because then it puts it on this plane of, well, it's just one more selection on this big smorgasbord of everything's okay. And I don't feel particularly comfortable with it. Doug, you had a question?
Well, so Gregorian chant is in Latin, of course, but it's my understanding that in the history of the church, there's been lots of chanting in various languages. Is that not the case?
That's not the case.
Greece? No? There's only
Not until the 60s. So the Mass was originally probably in Aramaic or something like that.
Right.
Okay, but once it got settled, it became the religion of the Roman Empire and so on. It adapted the language of the Roman Empire. It retained a few Greek, the Kyries in Greek, there's a couple of the Greek phrases.
Hallelujah and amen are Hebrew.
They're Hebrew, yeah, there's some Hebrew phrases in it, right. So it retained a few, but Latin became the language of the church. And that was sacrosanct until, now, there might have been rebels doing things that they weren't supposed to do, but it was pretty much sacrosanct until after the Second Vatican Council. You're gonna disagree?
Well, I just wanted to clarify, I mean, that's true in the West, but his point, I thought, was in terms of the other Eastern rites of the church. They have chants in their own.
Okay. Yeah, all right, sorry, the Eastern rites.
So where I was headed with the question is, it seems like to me like there are two factors. One's about chanting generally, and the other's about Latin. And so what I wanted to ask is there any possibility of English chant? Developing that in our churches
that's a
today?
good question. If we weren't in the age we're in, that might be a potential conversation. But given the age we're in, it makes me frightful, right? In fact, I think most traditional Catholics, if we had a conversation outside the confines of all the influence of the culture, right? And said, there are a few things maybe we'll think about. Like, for example, I think people might have said the gradual of the Mass. The gradual of the Mass evolved from a responsorial psalmody where the respond was repeated, but at some point in the history it got dropped, probably because of the Roman imperial masses that were shortened and so on. If they said, maybe we should return the respond to the gradual. I don't think people would get too crazy about that. It creates some problems, like if you're singing the Bird Graduale or something, okay. But in the big picture, right? Or maybe they would say, maybe we could add some prefaces or things like that, okay? But the problem is that when we had this conversation in the 1960s, the result of it has been so chaotic that most traditionalists have just kind of circled the wagons and said, okay, you know what? Look, you beat us up for 50 years. You wouldn't even let us have the Mass, and we don't trust you. And so come back in 100 years when we think we can trust you, and we'll have this conversation, right? Right? I mean, so they wear the fiddleback vestments, which is kind of a protest sign. It's not, right? I mean, there's all sorts of that stuff about it. I think in the abstract, you might have that conversation. I think this probably isn't the right time to have it. Now, I do think there are some advantages to Latin, right? Right? It's a universal language. It becomes the language of the whole church. I can go to Mass in Notre Dame Cathedral, and I'm sitting before Mass, and I'm hearing this person speak in some Eastern Bloc language that I don't understand, this person speaking in French, and that one speaking in Hispanic. And when the Mass starts and we're all singing, we're all singing the same language, right? So I think it's a unifying factor. I think the theology of the Latin is the medieval classical Latin and the expression of Catholic theology are so perfect. I mean, it was the right time in the language to be able to express those truths concisely and purely, and translating them is not, it's always a matter of how close can you get. It's not pure. So there's that issue. And then there's the issue that it's the music of, it's our music. I mean, these other, well, you're right, some of these, like the Byzantines, I think, do things in the, but if you go to a lot of these Eastern rites, they still sing in their ancient liturgical language, right? And so I think in the abstract it would be an interesting conversation. In reality, I think it's either not the good time, and my personal thought is I'd rather teach people to understand the Latin than to butcher them.
My only, can I offer just a bit of a commentary or a counter, but that I practically, what I've tried to do is introduce little bits of what sound like Gregorian chants, but are used in the vernacular. Even in Corpus Christi Watershed, where he was using some of his stuff there from, they're doing a ton of that, and they're trying to use the Gregorian chant melodies and all this sort of stuff, but they are forcing English onto it very much so. The only reason I like that at times, one, because it's way better than any of the other music we're using in English, and much more contemplative and apropos, I think, to the liturgy, but it also then gives them a little foretaste of what's to come with the Gregorian Latin chants. So that just practically I try to use it.
Let me add one thing to this stuff, and that is that when the Anglican Ordinariate was established, my first thought was, oh, they are going to restore the Serum Rite. This is going to be so cool. And so, well, but what happened, I don't know if you've seen the Ordinariate Missal, but the Ordinariate Missal is it's a Novus Ordo Mass, 3-year lectionary, but it has not just the options of the Novus Ordo Mass, it has more options. It has several options that they can use, only they can use, right? And they do it in sort of Cranmerian English, okay? But see, and that's why I think it's not a good time to have the conversation, because the impression was, if you go to one, your first thought is, oh, this looks like a traditional Mass in English. But when you get below the surface, it's not at all. It's just not at all. It's lots of bells and smells, but it's not, right? The texts have been changed, everything's been changed. And so it's another reason why it's just not the right time to have this conversation, because nobody's really open to it. They're just not open to it in a healthy way. I'm sorry, you're waiting for your question.
Oh, it's okay. It was not so much a question as about what the gentleman was asking. Gregorian chant is intrinsically based on Latin, in the sense that if you remove the Latin, it's something else. Because the accentuations, it's the life of the chant. You cannot, now in English or in French or in Japanese or Eastern Swahili, as you said, Father, it's a taste of what's to come, in the sense that it's a step in the right direction. But it's only a step, because it's not chant. So, apart from the fact that it might not be the time to talk about that because of different reasons, chant in another language is not Latin. In another language, it's not chant.
I've seen there's a German graduate that a guy did who sung this Latin, and it was kind of interesting. You could see that, but you're absolutely right. It's not the same. It's a different music.
And every language has its riches. There could be a music based on English. Why not? That's another question. But it's not chant. And an example of my little experience, I've been a missionary in kind of all over the world. I sang masses in lonely islands in Fiji. I sang mass in Gabon. I sang mass in North America, in South America, and everybody is capable of singing in Latin. I do remember boys' school in Gabon. I do remember a village in the middle of nowhere in Gabon, or even more, in an island, Rotuma, not far from Fiji. They had never had the Latin Mass since 1970. And I was there for the first sung Mass ever. Immediately they got it. Because it's, if you don't make it too complicated.
Was it Gabon where Monsignor lived?
Yes, I was in Libreville. But in Fiji, in the middle of the Pacific, they were capable. It has not been done for a long time. But
well, when the Jesuits were missionaries and Christianized all of South America and went and Christianized China and all those kinds, it was a Latin Mass, and they all sing in Latin. Right? So this is related to the question that I addressed to you. When we talk about taking steps, I'm getting old now, right? So I've heard this many, many times for many years about having people take steps. And you know, I've raised children too, so, and that's, you teach them to do things one thing at a time, right? Your child doesn't play a Mozart piano concerto, your child starts with very things and takes steps. So there's a certain logic about that. But my observation is that in general, we have a really, for the last 6 years, we have a really poor track record of getting people past the first step. We don't really take them any farther. And so I start to sweat when I hear that.
And practically as a priest too, if I may add that, you know, chanting the collects at Mass is a really big deal for some people, and obnoxious and weird, and people don't like it. But I've been intentionally doing that from day one of my priesthood. In my own heart and mind, I need to keep walking on that trajectory and taking steps in the right direction. Taking the step of ad orientem Mass, or taking the step of chanting more of the Mass, although I know it's traditionally speaking, you know, singing the Eucharistic prayer is a big no-no, but I've done it in order to just give people a taste of Gregorian chant as well.
Well, and singing the collects actually is in the first step of things that was mandated by the Congregation of Sacred Rites after the council. It's in the first class of things you're supposed to do before you do anything else. And so you're just doing what the Second Vatican Council has told us to do. So, yes?
So on that note, sorry, no pun intended, but so I appreciated you drawing the distinction between the propers and the ordinary, and in terms of the schola's historic responsibility for the propers as opposed to the congregation having for so long chanted the ordinary, right? You said it wasn't even until the 12th century that they had to put it down.
Right.
Yeah, so what strikes me is that balance is maybe part of why some people are resistant to the reintroduction of chant in the parishes, and why it's difficult, because I also have lived all over the place, and in my experience, where I've seen parishes introduce that is they don't pay attention to that distinction. And a congregation is put from, say, the congregation actively participating in singing, like they've been schooled in expressing themselves in music. As you said, music is a very personal expression. And all of a sudden, the music is taken from them and given to a schola that is very, very professional and very, very skilled. But the only people who can really appreciate that skill is kind of the schola themselves. And it kind of becomes a sort of, I couldn't think of what the right word of this is, but it's sort of like the schola is enjoying themselves immensely in this secret kind of way that the congregation doesn't have access to. And the people in the schola have been on their own journey, right? They grew up in the same congregation where they were singing the St. Louis Jesuits, right? And over time, they developed this great appreciation. And this is also my experience of seminarians who've become keenly interested in the older rite of the Mass. For them, it was a process. But when they get into their parishes, they impose it on people who haven't had that preparation. And, you know, certainly as, you know, Father, you've been trying to do something very more gradual and educative, but that's often not the case. And so, and yet there are a number of the ordinaries are very singable by a congregation in Latin, right? So, I guess, and that was particularly also stressed by Vatican II, that the congregation should be taught how to sing the ordinary in Gregorian chant, right? That the pride of place of Gregorian chant that Vatican II emphasized was not the schola singing very complicated polyphony up in the choir loft, that the congregation doesn't know what's going on because they don't even have the propers in translation, right? it was also that the congregation could
They
sing.
did before the council.
No, I'm talking about afterwards. The image of Gregorian chant that the council promoted included the congregation having having a role in that singing.
But that was also true as far back as Pius X.
Yeah, I'm
Just
not
so you
talking
know.
about going backwards, I'm talking about how did that look going forward. So one of the problems after the council was that so many changes in the liturgy were like overnight, like shock
It
therapy.
was total chaos.
Yeah.
And there were a number of sort of historical things that played into that, right? So I think in the 50s, Pius XII permitted Catholics to sing hymns at low mass, provided they were not singing the texts of the mass. They could not, right? So in the old days, it was high or low, all or nothing. There was none of this mix and match stuff in the middle. And so we said, all right, there was some pressure. We said, okay, you can sing hymns at mass, but you can't like sing a hymn that's the paraphrase of the introit or something like that. They have to be something different if you really want to do this, okay? And so when the council came, now, it was just like the dam broke, okay? There was all kinds of stuff going on. It was never authorized, communion in the hand, turning the altar around, it just went crazy, okay? And, but people that, and the vast experience of American Catholics in particular, but I think worldwide, was low mass for a number of reasons, fasting rules and resources and all kinds of things. But 8 out of 10 Catholics didn't experience high mass; they experienced low mass. And now they were singing hymns, and so the easiest and quickest transition was we'll just continue singing the hymns that we've been singing at low mass at the new mass. But all of a sudden, for the first time in the history of the church permitted substitution of proper text. And so those hymns weren't just something superimposed on the Mass, they actually replaced the proper. And so now, because the Mass was quickly becoming an egalitarian event, right? You're absolutely right. They now own these proper substitutes. And so anybody that tries to disrupt that situation, I don't know what you call it, okay, that right, is immediately now upset the apple cart, right? You now, because we own these texts, they are ours, and so to switch that, you're right, it creates enormous pushback. So there's a lot of sort of circumstantial things that fed into that, but you're right.
So just for clarification, are you saying that the congregation had not chanted the ordinary already for centuries before Vatican II?
Yes, I would say that not everywhere, but it was common that they didn't, and even more than that, it was the common practice that most congregations were experiencing low mass, no music at all.
Okay.
Right, and that, think about it. The church I grew up, we had mass on the hour from 6 to noon. Noon was high mass, every other mass was low mass. And until, I forget when the fasting laws have changed, but it was in the 50s, 53, 50, something, okay? So prior to that, if you wanted to receive communion, you had to fast from midnight, right? People they're not going to go to me. If you have children especially, and everybody had children, right? You are not going to go to the noon mass. Your kids are going to be scratching their eyes out by the time you get home and feed them, right? So people went to earlier masses, and they were all low masses. Very few people went to high mass. And so it just wasn't, the experience that we talk about as being the ideal experience was not the common experience of American Catholics. Actually, Western Catholics in general. It just wasn't the experience. So that created its own set of problems when you had this transfer, because you didn't have the right mentality going forward to make the transition.
So I guess your comment helps me focus my comment, which is maybe then, do you think it would be helpful in parishes that are trying to return to the patrimony of the church in this way, for all the reasons you guys have described, to focus on the ordinary because if the congregation thinks, well, we gotta sing, right? And we want to sing for those theological reasons that you point out. And the ordinary very often is, you know, the Missa de Angelis is very singable. I've seen in congregations. That would give them still that sense of participation, educate them in chant, so then a schola could possibly be introduced to deal with the propers. Whereas where I've typically seen it, and also seen resistance on a congregational level, is when all of a sudden the music gets sucked into schola that is very highly skilled, but the congregation isn't sufficiently educated and experienced enough to appreciate that skill. So then it becomes a combat between the schola.
Yeah, it takes a lot of
And the
preparation
congregation.
and the right kind of introduction. In fact, I'd even take it a step further. You know, after the council, the Sacred Congregation of Rites published a document, which is still the governing document of church music in the church, and nobody pays any attention to it. It divided into three. What it tried to do was say, all right, here's what we'll do. We used to have high mass, low mass. We're going to give you a vehicle now to sort of gradually move from low mass to high mass. And so what we're going to say is the first thing that you sing are all the dialogues, the responses to the orations and things like that. Then sing, the next thing is the ordinary, and then if you can, the proper would be the next thing, right? And so, you know, if the congregation's singing responses, all the responses that the priest is making, you know, singing and you know, that's a fair amount of singing, right? And then you can add the ordinary. You're right, that might help. I don't know. You know, in my parish, they sing a hymn before the entrance, just because they've always sung a hymn, and it was like, let's not fight this. You want to sing a hymn, sing a hymn. So they sing a hymn, and then we sing the introit when we come in for the mass. Right? So
I've also not complained, practically speaking, in parishes where I don't have music people to do music stuff. I'm happy to just have a low mass, no music at a normal ordinary form Sunday mass, because it's giving people a little taste of a low mass actually, and then it's another one of my little stepping stones, hoping that then we can start inching in goodness.
Doug, I know that David, oh, there you are.
We're-
I'm just kind of aware of the time. And
We're way over time. I mean, I've been reluctant to stop a conversation, but I know Father Gaines needs to get somewhere. So let's thank our speakers again.